So, welcome to the Ex-Religious Support Network. Our aim here is to provide a safe space for people who have left or are thinking of leaving their religion. To find us on Meetup, simply search for Ex-Religious Support Network. My name is Les Allen and I'm the group facilitator. This is the second session in a series of Q&A sessions in which we explore what it's like to think and walk in someone else's shoes. You've given up on your mission of pleasing the divine being and saving others. So what do you believe now? How do you live? And what do you care about? Out there is a smorgasbord of worldviews and stances to choose from. Our special guest today is Michael Dello-Iacovo. Michael describes himself as a Sentientist. A little about Michael. He attended a Catholic Jesuit school in Adelaide for most of his schooling and believed in everything associated with the religion. Around the age of 18, Michael had a rather painful transition from Catholic to outspoken atheist. He completed a Bachelor of Science and is currently finishing a PhD in space science. Valuing the application of reason to doing good, Michael became involved in the effective altruism movement in 2015 and served as CEO of Effective Altruism Australia in 2016. He has also been an active member of the Animal Justice Party, including running in several elections to further the cause of animal protection. Please welcome Michael. So to get us started, Michael, let me ask you three initial questions. So the first question is, can you say briefly what sentientism is? Because I'm sure a lot of people just have never heard of the term sentientism.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Thank you, Les, for having me. I've got some notes for some of those first few questions, which I'll refer to. I hope that's okay. So sentientism is about giving moral consideration to any and all sentient minds. I think the word itself is hopefully pretty descriptive in itself because it's sentient is part of the word of sentientism. And so it's about, that's one part, which is about what matters, giving moral consideration to sentient minds. And it's also about a way of thinking about what's real. So I'll talk about that second part in a second, but so for me, I would call myself a consequentialist or utilitarian. So since what I believe matters ethically is suffering, which is bad, and pleasure, which is good, then I believe that any being who is capable of experiencing suffering or pleasure is worthy of moral consideration. Jamie Woodhouse, who now runs sentientism.info, a central website for people to meet and talk about sentientism and get information on it. He says that he believes sentientism is or should be neutral to different ethical schools of thought. So, for example, like consequentialism versus deontology, that someone could be of any ethical school of thought and still be a sentientist. It just requires that you care about all sentient minds. And the second part, which is about using evidence and reason to work out what to believe in. So in other words, having a naturalistic worldview rather than one that invokes supernatural beliefs.
Oh, no, thanks, Michael. So the second question I have to get things started is, how did you hear about sentientism and how did you get involved in the movement?
Sure. So I think in many ways, for some time before I even heard the word sentientist or sentientism, I think I was already thinking along those lines. And I guess in hindsight, I would have called myself a sentientist back then, even if I didn't know the word. But to go a little bit before I heard the word for the first time, I was involved in the effective altruism movement, which you mentioned in my bio. And that's a movement about, it's about combining charity and rationality to try and do as much good as possible using evidence and reason to improve the world. And I had been involved in that movement for a while. I also became concerned about animal rights, became a vegan and animal protection advocate. So I was already thinking about how I can use evidence and reason to improve the lives of others, both humans and non-humans. And I first heard the word, it was an evolutionary psychologist on Twitter called Diana Fleischman, who is somewhat involved in the effective altruism movement. And I think I just stumbled upon her Twitter account, and her bio said Sentientist. And I think I got the gist of what that meant by looking at it. I figured it's like any ist, but it's about caring about sentient minds. And I really liked that. Well, I was about to, I think, answer the third question, so I'll leave that for a moment. Why I like the idea so much, why it really spoke to me. Specifically in sentientism, I don't think I would say I've been very involved in the movement per se. I mean, I've been involved with effective altruism. I've been involved with animal protection, in outreach and politically. I think sentientism is more, I see it as something that underpins all of that, rather than, at least for me, something that I'm specifically, like a movement that I'm specifically involved in and trying to promote. I think for me, I see it as something that kind of underpins everything else and kind of guides what I do in all other aspects of my life. I did speak on Jamie Woodhouse's podcast. So Jamie Woodhouse being the person who runs the Sentientist website, he has a podcast where he interviews people who call themselves Sentientist and talk about the ideas around sentientism and how it relates to the work that they're doing. So I was on his podcast earlier this year and spoke a little bit about that. And I think that's probably the extent of how I've been involved with sentientism.
That's great, Michael. So you already touched on my third question. What attracts you to the sentientist way of life? Is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, so I really like it because I feel like it's future-proof. So what I mean by that is in the past, if you go back, most people cared only about those most similar to them. So whether that's their community or their race or etc. The circle of moral concern was quite small and narrow. And over time, I think that circle has been pushed outwards to where most people care about people of all races, of all genders, all worldviews. And I think and then even more so recently, that circle is being pushed to include non-human animals as well. So because non-humans are also sentient, that circle of moral concern has been pushed where, as a whole, more and more people are including them in their circle of concern. It might seem like it can't go any further than to include non-human animals, other than to say, well, maybe if we found some non-human animals like aliens from another planet, then I guess we could include them. But I think by just saying that you care about all sentient minds in the word sentientist, that I think means you're accounting for any future discoveries or revolutions, like the possibility of artificial intelligence being sentient. I don't know if there were an artificial intelligence, I don't know if it would be sentient or not. But if it were the case that it was sentient, then I feel like that's already kind of captured in my worldview, where I just say, well, I care about all sentient minds. It turns out they're sentient, so I care about them, I guess. I just think it's useful and future-proof, and I don't try not to use too many labels to describe myself, because I don't like how narrow they are often. But I like sentientist because I feel like it's likely to always be true, even with some. I guess it would take a pretty big discovery, or maybe I'm not understanding some definition, for me to feel like concern about all sentient minds is not actually the best way to go about ethics. So I feel like it's future-proof and it covers everything that I care about.
Oh, great, Michael. I think that's a terrific introduction. Okay, so we'll open it up to our virtual floor here. If you'd like to put up your hand like this. Will, you are first cab off the rank.
Thanks, Michael. Would you consider that a cockroach then is sentient? Pretty basic question, I guess.
Sure. So I would err on giving benefit of the doubt anytime I think there's uncertainty, but I do believe that it's possible for at least some insects to be sentient. I think there is evidence of at least some species of insects and invertebrates being sentient to some degree. And to put it another way, I guess, if some mind is sentient to some degree, then they deserve some degree of moral consideration. And so I think, I don't know about cockroaches specifically, but I have no reason to believe that they can't be sentient to some degree. So I would give them some moral consideration.
If I could just follow up on that, Les, is the definition of sentience the ability to experience pleasure or pain, suffering or pleasure?
The to have some kind of experience, I guess something that it's like to be that individual.
But something that bugs me is I read somewhere that of all the insects, cockroaches seem to display various behavioural traits within the species, and it was put as they've got a form of intellect. And I have a phobia about cockroaches, and I still try not to put baits out for them, because once you put a bait out, the next couple of days you'll find them on the floor. Up here in Queensland, you know, if you don't control them, they're off and running. You'll find them the next day on their back kicking their legs, and I feel very sorry for them. What would you do? Would you annihilate the cockroach? I'm guessing you would.
I can tell you what I do because I do have insects, cockroaches and other insects in my apartment. I try to take them out usually.
Yep.
I don't know what I'd do if I had just a complete infestation of some kind of insect. I'm not sure. I haven't had to think about that, luckily. But usually if I find one insect, I'll either leave them or take them outside, I guess.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Will.
Nice.
Thanks, Michael. Adam had an early question.
I'm coming from a post-humanist background. Now, part of what comes up if you're thinking about post-humanism is the idea that we shouldn't really be centering our moral code around what it means to be human. And part of what comes up is also the understanding of, well, is sentience the guiding feature here? Is this what we really should be concerned about? Is this the anchor of what we use to include what goes into the circle of moral concern? So the question is, understanding what counts as sentience is important if it is the anchor of what we decide are moral agents that should be included into the circle of moral concern. So how would you describe or approach finding out what is the most primitive form of sentience possible now and in the future, as we understand more about life? And also, what's your view on what counts as a sentience primitive and what the most primitive form of sentience is that we know and understand today?
Sure, I can try and answer that. I guess from a theoretical perspective, as long as we think there is some reasonable chance that mind has some kind of experience, that it is a mind, then I would call that sentience. I don't know how I go about describing what is the most primitive form of sentience, because I guess, if we think about biological minds, they tend to have, well, I could be mistaken, but I think they typically operate in terms of neurons, and I suppose you could knock off a few neurons and still have some kind of sentience. Now, how low you can go, I actually don't really know or have an opinion on, because I guess you can go lower and lower and lower, and you keep going lower until now you've got 100 neurons, now you've got 10, and now you've got 1. What does that mean? I don't know the answer to that. That area is very far from my area of expertise, so I'm happy usually to just kind of take what other researchers or workers say about sentience in that, they say something like, it's reasonable to believe that bees have some level of sentience. Yeah, I don't know what that would look like in terms of getting closer and closer to some kind of cutoff point between sentient and not sentient. I suspect some measure of whatever the experience is would get less and less in some way. I don't know what's getting less and less exactly, but I don't think I've answered your question properly, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, that's great, that answer. At least if you don't know, I guess one of the follow-up questions would be, how would you go about trying to find out what would be a sentience primitive? And 2, I think there's a growing number of experts who sort of see the mind as more of a congress of smaller bits and pieces, more like, a number of modules that all fit together. And it's been sort of noted that if you sort of cut the corpus callosum and bits, you can sort of slice a brain in half and it'll still function. And awareness can be sort of isolated from one side to the other. So I'm just wondering if you'd consider the idea non-woo-woo, the idea that we could have aspects or modules in the mind which could be considered individual sentiences. It's a bit sci-fi.
Sure. Yeah. Look, I've heard about that. I don't know a lot about it. It seems plausible to me. I think I have to just say for both of those questions, unfortunately, it's just not my area. So I have to say I don't know. But I guess it seems plausible. And then, so what would that mean if you could split a mind into 2? I think I'd just say that they both are still worthy of moral consideration. They're both still sentient.
Have you heard of the Hogan sisters?
No.
They're Siamese twins conjoined at the head. They have a thalamic bridge going on, and they both seem to be able to experience each other's sensations. So they share parts of the brain, but they seem to be distinct individuals. But like, one of them doesn't like tomato sauce, but the other one does. And so one of them eats something with tomato sauces on it, and the other one screws up its face. One of them can see an object over there that the other can't see, but the other knows that it can just reach its hand in that direction and grab it. It's quite fascinating, and it might really, of course there needs to be a whole lot more study in this area to really know what's going on there, but it's fascinating. And when we think of individual sentiences, I kind of think that the future of thinking about sentience might have to change. Anyway,
yeah,
it's fascinating.
I'm sure it will. And just to comment on that, I guess, so you said that your question is coming from a transhumanist perspective. And yeah, I think how we think about sentience will change over time, and maybe there'll be some, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess just changed in how we think about sentience. So what does it mean for if we could have some kind of microchip in someone's brain that does some of the processing power of someone? What does that mean? I don't know, but I'm just neutral and open to whatever the actual experts in that area say about that. Like I said, what I like about sentientism is it's future proof, in that whatever that research comes up with, then I'm happy to just take that on board, I guess.
Thanks, Adam. Lorraine, you have a question.
Yeah, how does sentientism differ so much from religion? Because wouldn't there be some religious people who feel much the same as you do about the care of animals and so on? So, where is that? And what made you give up religion? Was it all just in one go, or did you do it little bit by little bit, chip it away?
Sure. Thanks for that, Lorraine. So I think the important distinction between religion and sentientism is the second part of the explanation I gave, which is it's about what is real. So it's about grounding our views in reality and what is real. And if it's not something that can be grounded in reality, like some of the supernatural beliefs of religion, then that doesn't fit. So someone could be religious and also care about all sentient minds, but I guess I wouldn't call them a sentientist, at least not under that definition of sentientism, just because they're not necessarily grounding everything in rationality and what is real in a naturalistic view. But otherwise, there could be a lot of overlap between someone who's religious and cares about sentient minds and someone who is not and cares about sentient minds. For the second question, how did I go about my transition from Catholicism to atheism? I think it was fairly quick. I think I'll just tell you how it happened. So I went to a Jesuit school from about grade 2 to grade 12. And it was really interesting to me recently I sort of did a lot of reflection on how I went about that process, because I thought that my parents were devout Catholics until after I became atheist and realized they weren't really. They would call themselves Catholic because their parents were all Catholic and their parents all believed. And then I happened to go to a Catholic school and happened to come home and say, the teacher said Jesus was a person who did this, and they're like, okay, that's great, and didn't really stop me from thinking that, or they would just have, they just let me think that. I guess I think they just kind of let me sort of absorb what they told us at school. And so then from about year 2 to year 12, I just took all of that, everything about Catholicism as just fact. And so I think what got me was at about year 12, and I was considering studying science at university, and I was very concerned about making sure that what I believed was grounded in some kind of evidence. It started to occur to me that I applied that logic to my religion, and little bit by little bit, it just didn't quite stack up. And I very quickly came into quite a panic, because I'd taken it for granted that there was an afterlife for all of my life. And now I was faced with the possibility that there wasn't. And that was very scary to me. So I decided I had to just make a very big effort to work out once and for all whether I believed in religion. I think if I'm being honest with myself in hindsight, it was very quick to realize that it didn't make sense. But I think in some kind of desperation, I continued to try and engage with some religious leaders and some people, some other religious individuals, and try and say, well, give them the benefit of the doubt and say, well, is there any evidence for this and that? And none of it ended up sticking. So, but overall, between when I stopped going to school and started questioning things to when I called myself an atheist, that was about 18 months. But I think realistically, I think the transition was faster than that.
Thanks, Lorraine. Neville, you have a question.
Okay, the meso sort of level, that is, the sort of level looking at both the theory and the practical. Thinking about mutual altruism, which is what I've basically read, and don't know, and that's in the first part of this question is this the same as what you mean by effective altruism, or is mutual altruism different? But in thinking about that, could you explain the relationship between what you understand as sentientist and a humanist?
So I'm not sure what mutual altruism is.
A mutual altruism is a position in ethics which basically sees a altruistic act, an act of kindness or compassion, as being two ways, not one way. So to be truly altruistic, to be truly caring, to be truly compassionate, it requires a relationship.
Sorry, just to check that I'm understanding right. Is that the idea that really someone only does some altruistic act, even if they say it's purely out of altruism, they do it to feel good about themselves or something? Is that?
Yeah, you're questioning whether it's really altruistic from a mutual or a reciprocal altruism. The view is that there has to be a relationship, whether it's equal relationship or not, that can be discussed, but it has to have a two-way relationship.
I'm of the view that probably people are altruistic for, some kind of personal benefit, even if they don't think so, and even if that personal benefit is just that they feel good about doing positive acts for others, or they feel bad if they don't. So in my view, effective altruism is a little bit neutral to that, in that it doesn't really comment on that. And I think it doesn't really matter. I think it's possible to accept that the worldview of that people only do good acts for some level of selfish reason. I think you can accept that, but also believe that, well, for me, that less suffering is good and more well-being, pleasure is good. And try to be as effective as you can about trying to bring about less suffering and more well-being. So I guess it's about using limited time and resources to do as much good as possible. And then whether that is for some selfish reason, I think is almost tangential to that. The second part, would you mind just reminding me of that?
So the second part is, thinking about what a mutual relationship. What is the relationship in the thinking of the sentientist and a humanist? Does it overlap? How does it overlap?
Yeah, sure. So I would imagine it does overlap. I have to say, so my initial impression as somewhat of an outsider, I think I went along to a humanist meeting once many years ago, and it's something. I think I agree with most of what they said. It just didn't stick, and I didn't go back for whatever reason. So my initial impression of humanism was that it was like sentientism, but for humans. But I've since been corrected by Les that that's not quite right. But that was my initial impression, at least. That's more or less what it was. From the broader understanding of what humanism is, I think there is a lot of overlap. And there are probably a lot of humanists who had never heard of sentientism and might hear that word and hear what it means and think, oh, that's what I think humanism is. That's what I have to say on that, I think.
Thanks, Neville. Niambo, you have a question.
Hi, Michael. So as a sentientist, do you believe that, let's say vegetarianism is acceptable, as in is it still acceptable to consume certain animal products if it doesn't lead to killing or harming the animal?
In the context of how animal agriculture works in Australia and in most societies in the world, animal products like dairy and like eggs, just thinking about it very broadly, you might think that, well, that doesn't require really animals to suffer or to be killed for that product. But I think for most agriculture, most animal agriculture in the world, it's very industrial and very focused on efficiency. So what ends up happening with even the production of those products is, so for example, with chickens, and I'll do my best to not be too graphic, but I mean, basically the male chickens are fairly useless for the egg industry. So they kill the male chickens as they're born for the most part. Then for cows, cows only produce, they're mammals, so they only produce milk kind of around pregnancy, after pregnancy. So that requires the farmers to induce pregnancy on the cows. And so I think there is still a certain amount of suffering, of death and exploitation in the production of those products.
Thanks, Niambo. Mark, you have a question.
What motivates you in your sentientness, given that you're not motivated by some feeling that you have for robots or cockroaches? You're motivated apparently to be kind and considerate to things that scientists and other experts say are sentient, even though you never considered them so to be. This seems like an article of faith to me.
Okay, so I guess there's sort of the surface level answer and then the deeper answer. The surface level answer is, well, what motivates me is, I know what suffering is like for me. I know what pleasure is like for me. And I'm able to I guess, extrapolate and put myself in the shoes of other sentient minds. And I figure that if it's, I know what the bad and the good experiences are like, and I want to reduce the bad and increase the good. Now, I know that's not fully satisfactory, because then the deeper level is, why is it that I want to do those things? Why is it that I want to bring about less suffering, more well-being? From the mutual altruism, there's probably something there for me. I guess the short answer is I don't know. I don't know when you go to the base level what is actually motivating me there. Maybe it's that I just feel bad when there's suffering and I don't do anything about it.
Thanks, Mark. Debbie, you have a question.
I actually am looking for a practical answer for this question. Like, I understand the kind of the philosophical side of what you're saying, and it's easy to understand that you would, care about things that are sentient on the basis that they suffer and can feel pleasure, etc. Like, what does that mean in a practical sense in your life and the way you make decisions when there are clashes between sentient beings, when there are competing priorities, when, like, do you understand the question I'm asking?
I think so. I guess to give an example to check if I'm understanding, like, one example that's kind of easy, I guess, is like, if I had $100 to donate, do I donate that to help humans or to help non-humans, or that kind of choice? Is that kind of what you mean?
Sure. That's an example of the kind of thing. I guess I'm curious in how you go about that kind of thinking and that kind of thing. First,
I'll just say it's very tricky. Sometimes I'm just not sure about what the right answer is, but I feel like I do my best to try and reduce the uncertainty, or to be as sure as I can. And then I think at some point we just have to act. I feel like often, sometimes people can get just so bogged down in the uncertainty of not knowing what to do that they end up doing nothing, or they end up being overwhelmed. And so I guess I try and be as certain as I can, and then try and do my best. And when I know better, I do better. But then maybe to drill down on that a little bit more, I guess. So questions like, how do I decide how many chicken lives or chicken hours of happiness are worth 1 hour of human happiness? And all those kind of very like fine-grained questions. Again, I guess I try and just do my best with the information that I have. And I figure if those minds are sentient, then there has to be some number of one that equals some number of the other. And then just try and do my best. And if I have some evidence to change my mind in the future and where that weighting is, then so be it. But I think that's broadly how I'd answer that question.
Thanks, Debbie. I've got a related question, a really practical question. As an animal activist, there's lots and lots of things that need to be done about the sufferings of animals here in Australia and around the world. And you've got limited time, limited money, limited skills. What do you see as the highest priorities, Michael, for an animal activist to work on?
This is the framework that is used often in effective altruism, of trying to think about, there are so many different cause areas. There's global poverty, there's global health, there's animal suffering, there's lots of things. And how do you think about different causes and what you want to spend your focus on? So there's 3 pillars of cause prioritization. First is scale. So how big is the problem in scale, or how good would it be if that problem went away entirely? Then neglectedness. So how neglected is this problem? And that's important, because if a problem is really neglected, then just one extra person going in to work on that problem, or an extra donation would be much more impactful than, say, a problem that's already not very neglected. And the last one is tractability. So how easy is it to do, or solvability? How easy is it to do something about that problem? A problem could be massive in scale. It could be very neglected, but if it's very hard to actually do anything about that problem, then it's probably not very worthwhile to spend your time and resources on. So that's how I think about those kinds of questions of prioritization, or what's the biggest priority. And then I guess the one extra part of that is sometimes personal fit can also come into play, where if you have a particular personal fit for working on one problem, then that, based on your skills or interests, that can play into it as well. But generally speaking, so living out the personal fit, I think a problem like animal agriculture, I think, is a really high priority, because it not only is it high in scale, quite neglected, and also fairly easy to do something about from the perspective of if we just think about the non-humans themselves, because there's 70 billion land animals farmed each year, and something like 1 trillion or several trillion marine animals fished or farmed every year. So it's huge in scale, but also it's some of the problems that animal agriculture makes worse also affect humans, which makes it, I guess, even bigger in scale. So, for example, like global antibiotic resistance and zoonotic disease transmission. A lot of diseases are more likely to spread and to jump to humans in the presence of intensive animal agriculture operations. Climate change is exacerbated by animal agriculture, and so on. So I think from that perspective, that's where I've chosen to spend most of my time and focus on in recent years, because I think it's so great in scale, so neglected, and it's something that we can make strides in changing. I also think it's important to think about the future as well. So I think future lives have moral value as well. So if I could do something to improve the lives of people in the future, I think that's also important. So I also think about how, I guess, in terms of thinking about future lives, there are so many potential future lives. Even if you just take something like humans over the next 100 years, that's so many billions of people who don't exist yet. So something that you do now to improve the lives of individuals in the future could have a really big impact as well, because there's just so many potential lives that you would impact. I mean, especially if you then take into consideration non-humans, and if you think about the potential of if life was to spread off of Earth, then that's even more lives into the future. So I think thinking seriously about and trying to do something about improving the lives of individuals in the future is also a very big priority. That's a hard issue because it's something where we just have a lot of uncertainty about what the future will look like. It's regardless, it's still a very important thing to think about and to try and do our best to improve.
Thanks, Michael. Nyamba, you have a question.
I've actually realized that, basically via the process of, stem cells and lab-grown meat, if you, for example, clone human flesh that you could consume, I've personally not really encountered any ethical arguments against it. I don't think that it is really unethical per se, but, I can understand many people have very, very severe reservations about actually consuming such meat. So can you maybe articulate an argument, let's say, against consuming lab-grown meat from an ethical perspective, so to speak?
I can try, because I think...
You think it isn't ethically problematic?
I don't think so, unless someone could present an argument to me why that would be the case, because, I mean, people have a certain ick factor, I guess, when they're presented that. Even if you say, well, the person who this came from, that the cells were harvested from, they were consenting and it was painless, people still might have some revulsion, whether ethical or just instinctual. I can't think of a reason why that would be bad.
Thanks, Nyamba. We'll go to Robert. You have a question?
I've been absolutely fascinated by all this stuff about cockroaches. Cockroaches are one of the most precious groups on Earth. The scavengers mean Earth is not covered with rotting bodies. They disappear. Similarly, termites are among the most precious things on Earth. The things that decompose wood mean our planet is not covered with dead wood, with all the organic material being chewed up in dead material, and no organic material left for living things. In pure enlightened self-interest, they are among our best friends on planet Earth. So I can't understand why people get so fussed about cockroaches, quite apart from which every species on Earth is absolutely precious. Billions of years of evolution have gone into it, just as they have into creating us. What's the problem with cockroaches being less important than we are? I'm just curious whether this enlightened self-interest argument has appealed to Michael.
I think there is some value in appealing to self-interest when, I guess, trying to encourage others in terms of behavior change. So part of, I guess, my pitch for when I talk about animal rights is if you can't get someone over the line to care about other individuals, or sorry, to care about non-humans, there are some self-interested arguments you can make. So regarding, for example, like environment, some people care about climate change because of how it affects them and their children and grandchildren. So that's a self-interested argument. I think it's useful to get the behavior change that we want without necessarily getting the ideology is not the right word, but someone can act in a certain way without necessarily having the same reasons as someone else. So I think it can be useful. For me, it's sort of like a backup, I guess, because I would prefer that someone cares about the individuals for their own sake. But if they're only going to behave in a way that brings about concern for other species because of a self-interested perspective, then I'll take that, I guess. Yeah, I think it can be a useful tool.
Thank you, Robert. Debbie, you're next in line.
This is just a curiosity question, actually. I'm wondering whether, like, how do sentientists approach the matter of when someone is no longer sentient? Now, I think that a lot of people, sometimes they go to, for example, a person who is experiencing brain death, but is still technically alive. But actually, and you're very welcome to answer that side of it. But I was thinking more of things like, do you see a need, for example, to respect the wishes of the dead? Is that a consideration? Once a person is no longer sentient, I mean, does it matter what they wanted before they died?
Yeah, good question. I don't think I've really been asked that or talked about that before, but I did read an article a few years ago which helped form my views on that topic. And the article was called, "We Go to Funerals for the Living, Not for the Dead." I like that because I think in strict terms, if we take the sentientist perspective, or even just a naturalistic perspective, once someone has died, then they have no interest in their wishes being carried out, let's say. But my perspective is it can be useful for a society to have an attitude where they tend to carry out the wishes of the dead. The living like to think that their wishes will be carried out, or that their wishes will be given respect and consideration after they've died. And so I think even though there is, in the simple sense, there is no one there to be harmed by their wishes not being carried out after they've died, I think on an overall societal level, there is still an argument for giving consideration to their wishes.
Thanks, Debbie. So, Lorraine, you have a question.
Yes, if one of your relatives or friends didn't become a vegan, how do you cope with that? Or do you just give them up as a friend, or, do you accept it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can speak from experience because I do have close friends and family members who are not vegan. The more time I have been a vegan, the more people in my network are vegan, just because that's sort of the mindset or the group of people that I tend to associate more with. But there are still people in my network who are not. And it can be hard, and it's challenging for someone, let's say a close family member of mine, to, I talk about why I think this is important, and I talk about why I think it's wrong to eat animal products and to have family members who just don't see it that way. I don't give them up as friends or as family, but it's tough to, I guess, interact with someone in the same way when they don't agree with you, and something that for me is very fundamental to the way I see the world. So yeah, I guess it's not like I have a hard rule or anything about how I view that relationship anymore, but it certainly changes the nature of the relationship.
Thanks. Now we're up to Mark.
This is something that's very fundamental to the way you see the world. You're talking about reason and evidence to make a better world for others. And then you talk about quantity of suffering. There's got to be something wrong with what you're saying here. You're talking about the future of the world and the human beings in the future. All the suffering that goes on with cattle and chickens, etc., would be avoided if we didn't breed those cattle and that chickens. We didn't need them anymore, right? So is that good for the world, good for the animals, that they never got born and never had to suffer? That's a good thing, I imagine, right? Okay, what if we breed lots of animals and give them luxurious lives? Is that a good for the world? If we breed 10 times that many and give them luxurious lives, have we done good for the world? Or 1,000 times that many? Isn't there something here that you're presuming or assuming, which is almost self-evidently wrong, about what is good for the world, what is the world, and what is not good for the world when it comes to sentient beings and how we treat them?
Yeah, so if I said what's good for the world, I would have meant that, I guess, in not a literal sense, because I don't think the world itself has any moral consideration. Yeah, I don't know if I said now, but I'm sure I've said something like in the past, like something like to improve the world or something.
Yes.
But I guess I use that as shorthand for improving the overall situation for sentient minds.
So the next one in the queue is Adam.
So firstly, do you think that there's some optimal trade-off between well-being and suffering? Do you see there being an asymmetry in value or disvalue? And how would that affect your policy choice?
No, not in one sense. And what I mean by that is I think I would imagine, in the absence of any reason to believe otherwise, that the peak of pleasure is as good as the peak of suffering is bad. In other words, for the hypothetical thought experiments that always come up, the way I think about it is one hour of someone or some mind experiencing maximum bliss and pleasure, that's worth someone's experiencing 1 hour of maximum suffering. Now, I know that there are negative utilitarians or negative leaning utilitarians who don't agree with that premise. They either think that suffering is much worse than the peak of suffering is much worse than the peak of pleasure is good, or that suffering is bad but pleasure is not necessarily good, it's neutral or something like that. I mean, I don't do the argument full justice because I don't agree with it personally. In one sense, I do think there is an asymmetry. I think that there's a lot of suffering in the world, or I guess in the universe, but on Earth. And I think it's easier to reduce that suffering than it is to increase well-being. So I guess from a policy or strategic perspective of how I would go about trying to, quote unquote, improve the world and improve the experience for sentient minds, I would tend to focus on trying to eliminate or reduce the worst suffering, rather than trying to get to very high amounts of pleasure for whatever individual. I mean, that's mostly from, I guess, a practical perspective, rather than like a more theoretical perspective of which one, like one being worth much more than the other. I think just from a practical perspective, I tend to focus on reducing suffering more than increasing well-being.
Thanks, Adam. Adam Doem, you've got a question.
I want to hear your thoughts about the flip side of animal farming and large-scale plant farming. I'll just say plant, vegetables, agricultural farming, and the impact that has. For example, deforestation, which might have a long-term effect on animal life, sentient beings, but also mass harvesters killing rodents and animals, clearing of land for other livestock, so forth. Actually, forget the livestock, I'm talking about plants. So how do you toss that up? Is it a lesser of two evils sort of a fight in your mind, or is it just that the animal agriculture and the hurt there on the farming side is a lot worse than any losses of animal life we may have long-term from mass agriculture? Thanks for the question. So, yeah, I think it's important to recognize that no way of living is going to be completely free of suffering, causing suffering. My perspective is to try and do as little suffering as possible through whatever aspect of my life that is. And we're talking about, I guess, diet or consumption here. Just a couple of things that help inform my choice of why I choose to eat plants rather than to consume animals. One is that the vast majority of land animals that are farmed are actually they're fed like plants that have been farmed, like grains or soy. And because of the inefficiency of, say, you have to feed something like 9 calories of grain or whatever plant food to a chicken to get back 1 calorie of edible food. Certainly there are animals killed by pesticides or in cropping, in combine harvesters. But if we are concerned about that, which I am, and I think people should be, then if you want to reduce that suffering, then it's still better to go the route of eating only plants, because you skip that inefficiency of having to feed 9 times as many plants. I mean, that's for chickens, and that's the best case. For other animals, it's even less efficient in terms of how many plants you have to feed to them. So yeah, from that perspective, I think, and even for deforestation as well, because a lot of land, I mean, most of the land cleared in Queensland over the last few decades has been to make room for more plants to feed to farmed animals. And same with the Amazon and some other areas that have had a lot of deforestation. Most of that is to produce crops to feed to farmed animals rather than to produce crops for human consumption. So I think we could reduce the amount of deforestation by consuming the plants directly. Does that answer your question? So would you, if you could raise a calf, say a sheep in your backyard that only ate the grass, would you then slaughter it and eat it?
So no, I wouldn't, for the same reason that I wouldn't do that to a human. But I take your point, and I think, yeah, I guess I could say that I think, I don't want to say that I think that would be good, because I don't, but I think that would be less bad than, an intensive animal agriculture operation.
Thanks, Adam. And Robert, you are next cab off the rank.
In Peter Singer's book, The Ethics of What We Eat, he argues that the brain activity of oysters and mussels and other mollusks is so minimal, so negligible, that he draws the line outside them and says they're edible because we're not causing them suffering. You obviously have come to a different position. I'm interested in hearing your justification for drawing the line in a different place from what he does, and what's your argument for that?
Yes, I think I probably would. I think I would agree that there is no evidence that oysters are sentient. I see they have some similarities with other animals, and that they have things like they have a stomach and so on, but it doesn't seem like they have any brain or conscious. They're not conscious, they're not sentient. And so from that perspective, I would not think that there's anything wrong with eating an oyster. Personally, I don't eat them just because, no real reason. I just don't want to.
They're slimy as well. They're slimy.
Even as a child, well before I was vegan, I hated the concept. I think some people get a little bit up in arms about whether we should call eating oysters vegan or not. But I think I'm happy to just say, well, there's no evidence that they're sentient, so I can't see anything wrong with that.
Thanks, Robert. Adam, you have a question.
Do species matter? Are you more worried about like the extinction of species? And I come at this from the idea that and I think you're familiar with some of David Pearce's work on the possibility of compassionate stewardship, which includes phasing out obligate carnivores or any form of life that causes suffering to other sentient life. And so to what extent do you think at some stage this will be technically feasible? And if it can be, if you believe that it's going to be technically feasible to achieve some form of like compassionate stewardship, do you think, is it important to keep species like tigers or lions that sort of prey on other life that don't want to be preyed on and that cause suffering? Do you think it's important to either phase these species out or keep them in some sort of virtual reality where they get to hunt down virtual zebras for time and all eternity?
I don't think species matter. I think it's only the individuals. The exception to that, I guess, would be if there was some argument for why it would be bad overall for the ecosystem or something, and that would have kind of run-on effects for there to be one species less or something. So I think that's separate, because that's kind of captured by trying to do the most good for the sentient minds. But simply speaking, no, I don't think species matter. If faced with a choice between saving one species from extinction or reducing suffering, I'd always pick the reduction of suffering. So yeah, I think so. What you're talking about is, I guess, wild animal suffering or natural wild animal suffering. So if we can reduce wild animal suffering safely, I think we should, for the same reason that I think if we could safely reduce stop humans from suffering from some natural cause, like some parasite or disease, then we should. And so I just apply that to wild animals as well. I personally, I see, say, phasing out of carnivores in the wild. I think that's part of the conversation, but I see, in my view, people when they think about this topic, they often get too hung up on that part of it. There's a lot of other ways that you can reduce wild animal suffering without even thinking about eliminating carnivorous species. Just to come back to your question, yeah, if there was a way to safely phase out carnivores or parasites in the wild or whatever have you that causes suffering, could do it safely. We were sure we could do it safely. We were sure there's no negative run-on effects. Then, all those bases covered, I guess I wouldn't see any reason why we shouldn't do that.
Yeah, it was a bit of an edgy question. I did want to ask it because it was edgy, but I also think it's important to think about when we're looking at the trajectory of how we approach reducing suffering and increasing well-being in the long run, given technological progress. That's all.
Yeah. You also asked, when do I think that's going to be possible? And I just, no comment, no idea.
Me too.
Maybe never, but who knows?
Thanks, Adam. So we'll go to Niambo, and then we'll make the last question Debbie, because we're right on 8:30. So Niambo.
Michael, what do you think are, let's say, the rights that animals should have? Like, what do you think are like the baseline rights?
Yeah, so I see rights as being useful but not intrinsically valuable. So even for humans, I guess I don't think that there is some kind of inalienable human right or right for anything. But having said that, I think rights are useful as a concept and as a guideline for how we should view things. I see for non-human rights, I think they should have the same consideration for equal interests as humans. So, I mean, I think Peter Singer talks about this, and I'm kind of just parroting him, but I agree with him. Animals, non-humans shouldn't have we're not talking about giving them the right to vote or anything like that, or the right to drive a car. We're giving them rights for their equal considerations, like the right to be free from suffering and that kind of thing.
Thanks, Nyambo. Debbie, the last question.
Okay, I just want to say up front, this is not a trick question because it's one of those questions, but I'm genuinely curious because it's a moral thing I've played around with in my head and I haven't got a good answer for it. I hate the idea that we, like vivisection, that animals suffer in order to create medical treatments. But equally, it's very difficult for me to contemplate saying to my cousin, yes, I think your 2-year-old should have died of leukemia, rather than there being treatments developed using animals. So, I can't deny that there are benefits to humans that it's hard to give up because they in themselves create so much suffering too. And I just wondered, is it very clear cut to you? Do those things present you with any kind of trouble, or do you see it as a very straightforward question that we have no right to make any other species suffer for our sake?
Yeah, I don't think it's an easy one. I mean, the medical system has had a lot of benefits and research to humans, but it comes at the cost often of suffering from an exploitation of non-humans. The way I approach that is to try and add it all up, I guess. So how much benefit has come about from the animal suffering. So, I guess my pushback to that is, I really want us to get to a world where we don't have animal use in medical testing. And I also question a little bit, just how useful has it been and how many. So, for example, I guess it comes back to the question of how do you add up, how much suffering from one being is worth how much well-being from another being. If it's the case that there's some very rare disease and it would, there would be thousands of fishes or mice or whatever that have to be tested on, and it would, we expect that testing, which would be very painful for them, and we expect that to maybe, let's just say have, a small chance of a small increase in quality of life or chance to save someone's life. If it's there has to be, I think, some number of animals tested versus some small amount of human benefit where it actually just couldn't justify it. Yeah, I guess I try and weigh it up, and it is a very tricky one. For some things, I think it's more clear cut. I've had 2 shots of AstraZeneca, even though there was some animal use in that. I think the benefits of that outweigh the negatives. But still, I would want to try and push us to get to a system where we don't have to use animal testing, where we can use computer models or human challenge trials or human in vitro cells to do the testing instead. And that's, I think that's something important to push for.
Thank you.
Okay, let's draw this session to a close. Thank you, Michael Dello-Iacovo, for speaking on sentientism and what it's like to lead the life of a sentientist. I think we've all learned a lot from you tonight, and I think we're all very thankful for being so giving of your time. So thank you very much, Michael.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, to get the videos of previous sessions, go to the Rational Realm website. That's rationalrealm.com, and go to the philosophy resources section.